Amazing. So I'm Raoul Maarseveen. I'm a fifth-year PhD student at Uppsala University, and I'm very grateful and glad to be presenting my job market paper here today. We'll be hopefully presenting it a lot more this year, so I'm really curious for all the thoughts, all the comments. I'd like to keep on polishing it, as I guess most of us have been doing, will be doing, and we'll do at some point. So the paper I present here today is the effect of urban migration, education, and attainment, evidence from Africa. And kind of the starting point of this paper is that what we observe is rapid urbanization of the developing world, basically since at least the 80s, both in Africa, but also in Latin America and Southeast Asia. What's kind of interesting is that despite the rapid urbanization of the world, we actually know very little still about the effects of rural to urban migration on the economic outcomes at a very individual level. And this is particularly so for the case for children, which I'm going to focus on in the majority of my talk today. And if we think conceptually about what does it mean to grow up in a city or to grow up in the countryside or to migrate from the countryside to a city, on the one hand, you may think, well, moving to a city may offer access to jobs and education that's typically not available in the countryside. Think also about higher education or tertiary education. But at the same time, there's been a very large historical literature that kind of points out the risks of cities as poverty traps. The idea is that many of the urban migrants are at least at risk of residence in the slum, with the idea of this is temporary, which slowly becomes permanent. It's very hard as a family to break houses over generations. And kind of to illustrate this point, there's been a study in 2016 by the UN data. They find that about half of the urban residents in Africa lives in what they describe as slum-like conditions. So things not having access to electricity, or not having access to running water, or not having access to improved sanitation. And if you look at the share of urban migrants or recent urban migrants, kind of the share is far higher still. So kind of the bigger question I want to study in this paper is, well, does urban to rural migration in such context improve the opportunities of households? And in particular, what I'm mostly interested here, what does it improve the opportunities of the offspring? Is kind of migrating from a rural area to an urban area as a household, is the viable way to improve the outcomes of your children? So I'm going to focus specifically on the effects of urban residency during their childhood. And I think this is interesting for two reasons. Well, first of all, the population of many developing countries is very young. Say in Africa, for instance, the median age in the countries I studied is about 18. So actually the majority of the residents is actually underage or very young. So it's quite relevant to see what are the experiences of them to study in or to live in the city. And secondly, most of the literature so far on rural to urban migration be focused on adults who grew up in the countryside and then moved to the city during adulthood. And during this period, of course, their skills and a lot of the knowledge they accumulate is already fixed. They bring their skills to a new labor market. But what's very interesting about studying children, as do in this context, is that kind of the skill formation and the educational attainment is still outstanding. So by studying children, what to do in this context, we also see, well, what's the effect of growing up in a city on skill formation? Well, empirically, what I'm going to do is I'm going to estimate kind of an exposure design, because as you can imagine, well, kind of cross-sectional designs, children in urban areas and rural areas, very different, the households are very different. So to get at some kind of exposure to a city, I'm going to compare use identification strategy of Chet and Hendren, 2018, and I'm going to use the differences of children in age when their households move to cities to generate kind of exposure, urban exposure. So I'll compare the outcomes of children, say, move to a city at age 6, which also move from a rural area to a city at age 12, to kind of see, well, what's the effect for children of spending these years between age 6 and age 12 in the urban environments. In terms of data, I'm going to use census data from 14 African countries to estimate the models. What's really nice is the countries are rather large, and the findings are representative for countries containing about 500 million individuals. Very quick preview of the findings. So what I find in this paper is that spending the childhood in a region which is about 1% more urbanized increases primary school completion rates among children by about 0.08 to 0.10 percentage points. School attendance at age 13 to 18 by about 0.04 percentage points, and literacy rates by 0.04 percentage points. And if you translate this in something a bit more conceptually close to what the average individual goes through, these findings mean, or these estimates mean, if you move from a place at the 25th percentile of the density distribution to, say, a large city or capital city, it increases primary school completion rates by about 8 percentage points. But also finds that the gains in educational attainment are visible both when you compare basically all the children who move from a rural area to a city, but you also find these increases in educational attainment if you compare children within the household who were different ages when the parents moved. Say one sibling was age 4 when the parents moved, the other sibling was age 8. If you compare the outcomes, you still see that the child who was typically younger and thus spent more of the childhood in urban environment has better educational outcomes. I find no evidence that any of these effects are driven by household selection based on either way the age of children or shocks in the region of origin. Because one thing you may, for instance, worry about if most of these migration events of study are driven by, say, violent shocks in the region of origin, maybe it's not so great that you move to the city. It's more about being out of your region of origin. Don't find evidence for that. And finally, I find that the increase in educational attainment is accompanied by a decrease in labor force participation. There could be some other channels you could think of. You could think that moving to a city or growing up in a city affects family formation decisions. I don't find much evidence for that. Well, instead, I find that the availability of schools and the lower opportunity cost of education are kind of the key drivers of this increase in educational outcome. So what I want to do with this paper is I kind of want to make a contribution to 3 literatures, the few smaller other literatures. I think these are my main focus. The first literature I want to make a contribution to is on the effects of rural to urban migration more generally. It's kind of been, I think, started by Young, his 2013 QDE paper, and there's been a lot of work and interest on these in the recent years. And basically all the existing papers study adulthood migrants. What happens to the wages of an adult individual if he moves from the rural environment to a city? And the ways in which estimate is different. For instance, Brian Chowdhury Mubarak run an RCT, which they kind of lower the cost of moving to a city. Other papers use individual fixed effect models, but it's always focused on kind of adulthood experiments. So what I contribute to the study on the effects of rural to urban migration is one, I can focus on what happens to children, what's the effect when children move from rural area to city. And secondly, because I study children, I can also say a little bit more about the role of cities in human capital formation and development of skills. The second literature I want to make a contribution to is kind of literature on the role of urbanization, economic development more broadly, and African economic development specifically. Because if you look at a more traditional kind of growth literature, urbanization and structural transformation are typically seen as kind of 2 sides of the same coin. The main role of cities in economic development is enabling individuals to move from agriculture into manufacturing. And what's kind of interesting is that, particularly in Africa has really rapidly urbanized over the last 30 years. But the share of the manufacturing sector has been kind of relatively flat. So this has led a whole host of scholars, including Godin and Jebab from Volrat, but also some of the World Bank reports, kind of to ask, well, what exactly is the role of cities in Africa's economic development if they don't seem to really do that much for kind of the structural transformation channel? So what I want to contribute kind of to this discussion is highlight a different channel. Namely that, well, cities can also contribute to growth by increasing human capital accumulation rather than structural transformation, kind of improve the skills of the population as a whole. And finally, there's an urban economics literature, which I want to contribute to, which is rather small. It's been mostly theoretical, which argued that workers in cities are likely to have higher rates of human capital accumulation. And the Leroga and Puga in their 2017 RESTEP paper also test this in Spain. But again, all of these papers have really been focused on human capital accumulation in working life. And what they do in this paper kind of extends this literature and this urban economics literature to the period prior to labor market entry, when we kind of engaged in full human capital accumulation. So the outline of the rest of the talk will be as follows. I'll first discuss a little bit about the context, methodology, and the data I'm used. Then I'll present the results. I'll present some robustness tests and heterogeneity analysis. I won't go through all of it in detail because there's a lot in the appendix. I don't think so interesting to kind of focus on the big points and the big, more important robustness checks. Then I will discuss a little bit about mechanisms, and finally I'll conclude. Are there any questions at this point yet?
Oh, fine. Please go ahead.
Perfect. Thank you. So a little bit of kind of, I've been talking a lot about urban, rural, and education, a little bit of like a background why we think that this might matter. So what I've plotted here is for the most recent census of all the African countries, what share of the children aged 15 to 16 has completed primary school? And most of these censuses are very recent. They're from the late 2000s or the 2010s. So this is not kind of 80s or very old census. This provides a kind of good picture of the urban-rural education gap in Africa today. And what we see in that virtually all African countries, with the exception of the small island nation of Mauritius, children in urban areas are more likely to complete primary school. And these differences are quite substantial. Across the countries which we have data, children at the age of 15, 16 who live in urban environments are about 25 percentage points more likely to complete primary school compared to children who live in rural areas. And if you look, for instance, at something like literacy rates, which might be the most basic measure of educational attainment, we also there see very, very similar differences. But of course, the key question, if you have any kinds of urban-rural gap, and I'm kind of an urban economist by trade, so I spent a lot of time studying these things, as well, we know that households in cities, the parents are typically better educated, the parents are typically wealthier. There's some studies showing that urban households have higher cognitive skills. So are any of these differences that we observe in urban and rural outcomes between children, do they have something to do with the environment children grow up with? Or does it simply reflect that children who grow up in cities typically have wealthier parents or better educated parents? So to separate between these two explanations, I'm going to use an identification strategy which has been first used in Chetty and Hendon, their 2018 QTE paper. And the key assumption which kind of underlie their, and by extension my strategy, is that families who move across large distances are driven by factors such as job opportunities and economic, or potentially in the case of Africa, kind of climatic conditions. And as such, the timing of migration is not going to be driven by the age of children at the time to move. And keep in mind, like the moves I'm talking about here, the moves I'm studying, are really long distance moves, typically over 100 to 300 kilometers or much more. So we don't talk about moving from a rural area to a nearby city a few kilometers or 20 kilometers away. Given this assumption, and we're talking a lot more about this assumption later on, I can infer the effects of growing up in a city or spending time with a child in the city by comparing children who move to an urban environment or to a city at different ages. For instance, some children may move to a city or will move to a city with their parents when they're age 5. Other children move to an urban environment with their parents when they're, say, age 8 or age 10. What we're going to do is we're going to be comparing the difference in outcomes of children who move to cities at various ages. This under the assumption, kind of the selection of households in cities does not depend on the age of children. It's going to tell me something what it means to spend certain years or certain ages in the urban environment. And they're going to provide, when you think about this, you may directly start worrying, well, maybe certain types of parents have great foresight, they see these differences, they realize that growing up in the city might be beneficial for the children, and certain types of households start moving at younger ages. I mean, I'm going to provide you with a wide range of robustness checks here today, which kind of is going to assess the validity of this assumption, the idea that children kind of extend to move versus their age does not drive the migration decisions. And I'm going to find that, well, Chetty and Hendon found that this works kind of well in the context US. There's been follow-up studies in Australia works well. And today I'll provide, I think, relatively strong evidence that this also seems to work well in the context of Africa. So the econometric model, which I'm going to estimate, is going to be as follows. I'm going to analyze 3 educational outcomes. I'm going to look at primary school completion. I'm going to look at literacy rates. And I'm going to look at school attendance at age 13 to 18. It would, of course, also be very interesting to study later outcomes, say secondary school education, university completion. But the problem you then get is that often you can't link children to the households anymore. So you don't really have a lot of household characteristics. You can't identify siblings, etc. So in this paper, I'm really going to focus on the individuals aged 13 to 18. And correspondingly, I'm also going to study educational outcomes which are attained at kind of lower ages, such as primary school completion or literacy. On the right-hand side, I have 3 terms. I first have a region of origin fixed effects, which I vary by the census year which I'm using and by the birth cohort, which kind of reflects the shared experience of children who were born in a given region, in a given cohort. Well, next, what you may realize is, well, moving, of course, can be very disruptive. You can think about it in the Western context, but in any context, when you move, you have to find a new schools. This might be very disruptive to the schooling career. So I'm going to include a term or fixed effects, which varies by the age of the children move. And I interact this with both the country they're in and the age at which they move, as well as the senses, to kind of capture what's the disruption effect in general of moving at a given age. And the third term here is kind of the term of interest. And in particular, what I'm interested in is the beta M estimates. And what these beta M estimates capture is what is the effect of migrating to an urban environment at various ages. So what's the effect of migrating to an urban environment age 1? What's the effect of migrating to an urban environment age 5? What's the effect of migrating to an urban environment age 10, all the way up to age 15? Now, the key assumption here is that this, or the beta M estimates for each age correspond to two things. Children who move to an urban environment, say at age 5, may have better or worse educational outcomes because of two reasons. One is they move to an urban environment at age 5 and they live there until we observe them. But also, of course, there's selection of households into urban environments. So children who move to city may always do better anyway because simply for wealthy parents. The key assumption which is going to be underlying my identification strategy is that the second term, which is the selection of households into cities, is independent of the age at which children move. And under this assumption, I can obtain these kind of urban exposure effects from the differences in the BM estimates. The difference, what's the effect of moving to city at various ages. And this specification is very flexible. In the baseline specification, I just compare all the households, but you can start adding, for instance, various household characteristics. And eventually, I think it's maybe most convincing text can also include household fixed effects, in which you get all of your exposure of children in the same households who made the same move, but who were simply at different ages when the parents moved to their environment.
Raoul, I
yes.
just interrupt you at this stage because it seems that your conceptual framework rely on the fact that we imagine a whole household migration to urban area. And we have a question related to this big assumption coming from Marion Richard, saying that, do you differentiate whether these children live with their parents, relative or others? Because it could be that children are moving because of, child fostering. And child fostering could be motivated for domestic work from one part, and from the other part to improve the access to education. So it could be correlated with what you are looking for.
Yeah, that's a very good question. For inclusivity in the baseline estimates, I do not restrict. I restrict only on being related to your household head. So if you think about foster care or migrating to different families would not be included. I do not, in the baseline estimates at least, restrict it to living with your parents. And that's for the reason that quite a few censuses don't really include this information very detailedly. For instance, in the Benin censuses, I think 60% of the individuals lives in what's defined as other relative. So if you throw those all out, you get kind of a skewed estimate for these countries. But I do have robustness checks where I indeed do what you suggested and restrict it to only children who live with the parents. And the findings are essentially the same. There's no change in that. But because the effects are the same, it doesn't seem to matter in kind of my baseline estimates. I focus on all the moves where you live with a relative, simply because, well, otherwise you get very, very few movers in certain countries.
Okay, I can imagine you have a lot of data constraint with those censuses. Maybe another way to look at it, it would be to look if all household members have the same previous residence and move at the same time, just to know if it's really a whole household migration or just the child changing residence. And we have a rising hand from Martin. Please go ahead, Martin, if you want to ask a question.
I prefer to see the data before asking. I'll ask in a minute.
Okay, perfect. Thanks for this comment. Yeah, it's very valid. I do indeed restrict on being on the same region of origin and the same time with I allow, I think, for 2 years of difference, because it's always asked of each household member individually. And what you see, there's often a bit of rounding off. So like relatively few people report moving 9 years ago, and more people report moving 10 years ago, which on the very fine margins may make a difference. But when it comes to the households, I allow for minor deviations there. Yeah, it's a good point. In terms of the data, the main data source I use are the African census data from ICOMS International. And the reason I use census data is because the models or the estimation strategy is kind of heavy, because you don't estimate what's the effect of moving to a city. Now you want to know, is the effect of moving to a city at age 6 different from age 8 or age 10, which is very, very data intensive. So for instance, DHS survey just doesn't have the observations for this. And I select the census based on 2 criteria. I select whether a census has information on the previous place of residence or the place of birth to kind of know where people are coming from. And most importantly, and this is kind of the biggest constraint, is that I want the census to contain information about how long individuals have been living in the current locality. With these 2 pieces together, enable me to kind of construct a migration history on the individual level. Out of there are 28 African countries in total with census data available. 14 of the countries satisfy these 2 criteria across in total 26 countries, and they jointly contain 57 million observations. And what's really nice is that the census extracts I'm working with are typically 10% random samples of the full population census. So the data I have is representative for countries containing about 550 million individuals. From the census, I restrict the sample to those between ages 13 and 18, because, well, you kind of want to have children who are old enough that they have some educational outcomes completed, such as literacy rates and primary school completion in many countries. But you want to have them be young enough that they did not yet start moving independently of the parents, and you get all kinds of concerns about cohabitation bias. But the exact ages doesn't really matter. If you estimate it's a 14-year-old, 16-year-olds, 18-year-olds, you get very similar results. And this provides me kind of with a core sample, about 460,000 movers, which I'll be using in the estimates. If you look at the countries that are included in the sample, it's relatively well spread across Africa. What's most obviously missing are censuses from very poor countries, such as the DRC and, say, the Central African Republic, because these countries just don't have census, or at least they don't have publicly available censuses. But otherwise, the censuses I have are kind of well spread across the African continent. I see a question from Martin.
Yeah, I think now is a good moment. Thank you. I wanted to, now that you are showing these regions, right, most of them are quite big, right? So families may still migrate to cities or to urban areas within these regions, right? So I don't know if you can give us a sense of the migrants that you are looking at. Are they the bulk of most rural to urban migration, or is this a very minoritarian group, right? And a second question, maybe when you discuss about how you measure urbanization, I think it's interesting. Some people may go to areas that have lower urbanization, but they are still moving from a rural to a urban area, right? So to me, this is a very different exposure. It's not the opposite of going. So to me, it's not the same to have one less exposure to an urban city than one more year of exposure, because the families to choose to move to less urbanization are potentially different than the families that choose to move to a higher urbanization areas. So even if you do this exposure by years of exposure, when you compare moving towards more or moving toward less, I don't know how to treat these people altogether. I think this may, I don't know, we can discuss later, but I was just like, should we have all these people together, those who choose to be more exposed and those who choose to be less exposed, treat them like as if they were the same? Those are my questions.
Yeah, those are very good questions. I think your first question is actually very interesting, and it should be able to estimate, at least in a bunch of census, how much of the rural to urban migration I'm capturing with this data, because of course I impose the restriction that you have to move at least across regions. So I do miss indeed all the rural to urban migrations takes place on a smaller scale. I've not looked at how many of the rural to urban moves are kind of long distance versus short distance. It would be really interesting. I'll definitely look at that. Regarding your second question, the regions, yes, they are kind of big, and that is mostly driven because the region of origin in some countries, such as say Ethiopia or South Africa or Ghana, is relatively rough. And in the baseline estimates, I kind of use identical regions for all the estimations for current region of residence and previous region of residence. In the appendix, I had these same concerns, like, oh, maybe, you know, people move at different age, move to very different regions within these kind of broader regions. So there I've been using the more detailed information you have available on the current region of residence, for instance, in Ghana or also South Africa. And I do not find any evidence for that. If you see more detailed current region of residence data, you get the same results. Similarly, you might worry about people move at different ages coming from very different regions within their region of origin. And about half of the censuses I use ask households within the region where you come from, did you live in kind of an urban or rural environment? When I control for that, it basically does not really affect the estimates in any noticeable shape or form. But it's indeed something I've been concerned about, but it does in practice, the size of the region does not really seem to matter. Regarding your final question, yes, I indeed treat individuals, at least in the baseline assets, move from a rural area to a city and from a city to a rural area. I both use them in the estimation, and you're completely right that they may have different motives to move, and also might be different households. And that's also what I find, taking a little step forward already, is also what I find empirically. I find that households who move out of a city, like the later their children move, the better it is. But kind of this loss of moving out of an urban environment is significantly smaller than the gains for children who move to an urban environment. So this definitely suggested some kind of spatial selection by now. Thanks for the questions. Now I'll continue. Also, indeed, getting to the urbanization measure, there's kind of a lot of ways in which you can define urban. You can use kind of the census measure, which for the households has the urban rural measure. The problem is often they just assign them to the district. So if you live in a district that's administrative capital, you count as urban in the census, no matter where you actually live. If you don't happen to live in like a regional capital or regional administrative capital, you're rural, so that's not perfect. So what I use instead is I use the percentage of the population living in an urban area in both the current and previous region of residence to kind of calculate this change in the urbanization you experience. And what's really nice, and things have been great for this research, that the data on the urban population comes from the Africa Polis database, which contains the current and historical population for all African towns across all of Africa, with more than 2,000 or more than 10,000 inhabitants in 2015. But the results are very similar when you use other urbanization measures such as population density, follow census definition, or if you only look at kind of migrations to and from the capital cities. And what's the interpretation of the BM estimates in baseline mean is what's the effect of moving from a region that's fully rural to a region that's fully urban at a given age. So when I'm talking about moving to a city, I mean the effect of moving through households moves from rural region or fully rural region to a fully urban region. But it's identified in the end of the entire distribution.
Yeah,
so in terms, yes.
Sorry, I have a small question about the Africa Polis database.
Yes.
So you say that it doesn't take into account the towns that have less than 10,000 inhabitants. So I guess that these towns are also the most rural ones. So do you have information about how many towns are not taken into account in Africa Polis? And since you don't take them into account, does that mean that what you estimate is like maybe a lower bound effect of moving from rural to urban areas or not?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. It's I don't have a sense of how much I miss there, simply because the data in that sense is not collected. I think that what the Africa Post database gives me is kind of consistency, like having one definition of what's urban across all of Africa. So we don't talk about 10,000 kind of different definitions, because each country, when you look at the urban definitions, it's very, very different often. But yeah, you're right. It's definitely what you lose is migrating to, say, smaller towns, say 5,000, 6,000, 8,000 inhabitants. Yeah, I think that's just a data constraint. In this case, hard to get around. So at least what you get here is, well, how many individuals live in what I think anyone would call a somewhat larger town of 10,000 inhabitants. I see one more question.
Yeah, just a quick question connected to your motivation at the beginning. What's going on with the slums, with the population living in the cities, but maybe like passing by or not registered, or like with this kind of like, is this also like something that they aim to capture in this data?
Yes, exactly. The slum populations are captured. Now we'll just talk a little bit later about what the effects of individuals who at least live without access to kind of the standard features as electricity or piped water you would expect in at least certain cities. Moving on at least here now to the baseline results. What I've plotted here is what's the effect of moving from the rural environment to a city at the various ages on primary school completion. And there are, I think, two important things that stand out from the figure. First of all, in most African countries, primary school completion or primary school status kind of determines age 13 and 14. You don't see enormous increase after that. So the fact that if the children move from the rural region to the urban regions, age 13, 14, 15 are still about 13 percentage points more likely to complete primary school is clear evidence of selection. Like households who move to cities, we also see it in data, typically better educated, the wealthier, etc. And that's also something we see here. If you move to a city at any age, you're more likely to have complete primary school, even if you live in a country where you already typically complete primary school before that age, which is clear evidence of selection. At the same time, you also really see that the age at which children move to an urban environment kind of matters. When children move to an urban environment before the age of 5, they are about 20 percentage points more likely to complete primary school, compared to children who move to after the age 12, who are about 30 percentage points or 12 percentage points more likely to complete primary school. So if we're willing to make this assumption that the age at which children move into a city or move to an urban environment is independent of the age at which they move, we can treat this or difference of 8 percentage points as the effect of spending the years prior to age 12 in an urban environment. Well, to say this, of course, conditional on the assumption. And the first way I think to start testing this is, well, you may be worried, maybe children move to an urban environment at younger ages, they just have better educated parents. So what I do instead is I start controlling for the education and the literacy of the household heads. And what we see is that I can account for quite a substantial amount of the selection of households into cities. This estimate for children move at later ages after age 12 drops by half. But the difference between children who move at younger and later ages stays the same. Also conditional household head education, household literacy, we still see that children who move to a city in early ages are about 8 percentage points more likely to complete primary school. And what's also interesting, I think, is that most of this effects, most of the change is really located between moving before the age 5 versus after age 12, whereas if you move at age 1, 2, 3, 4, it doesn't really matter, which is of course also consistent with being in an urban environment during the schooling age. The next step you can take is, well, let's start including household fixed effects. I think this is kind of the most extreme in a sense. What you see, the standard errors also get much larger, of course, because you throw away most of the variation. You only start comparing siblings. And what you find in this case is that, well, even if you control for household fixed effects, so you start comparing children within the same households or siblings within the same households, you restrict this, what we was a question about before, that you only have children with the household heads, the picture looks basically identical. You still see that if you compare children within the same household, if you compare siblings, those who were younger when they migrate to an urban environment do have significantly higher rates of primary school completion. So these effects or the estimates I'm estimating do not seem to be driven by selection based on the household at least. Well, one common concern, and there's been a lot of literature on this in the context of Africa, is, well, what actually happens afterwards, like secondary school. attendance, it becomes a more important topic, particularly now moving towards slowly, still their universal primary school completion. If you instead look at school attendance age 13, 18, we very much see the same effects. On the right-hand side, I kind of prefer to show you the graphs because I think they're kind of most honest in a sense and they're most data-driven. And they're very noisy because you put any kind of structure on that, be it linear, be it piecewise linear, these Hausdorff fixed effect estimates are significant at 0.1%. And the same goes for literacy rates. You may worry, well, okay, we see that children in schools, they have higher primary school completion rates, they have higher rates of school attendance at later ages, but do we also see that they have better learning outcomes? And the one learning outcome, which is kind of widely available in the sense, is literacy rates. And if we look at what's the effect of migrating to an urban environment at various ages of literacy, we see that those who migrate at the younger ages, say before the age 5, are about 4 percentage points more likely to become literate compared to children who migrate to an urban environment at the later ages. In terms of robustness, I mean, basically what I've done here, and this relates to the questions that Martin had, I just count all the moves and I just look at, well, how urban was the region you came from, how urban was the region you moved to. The results are very similar when you use other urban definitions. For instance, census definition, or if you use population density, or I think what's most interesting, if you only look at the migration to and from capital cities, what you find is that migrating to a capital city before the age of 5, 6 increases your primary school completion by about 5 percentage points, increases your school attendance by about 5 percentage points, and improves your literacy rates by about 2.5 percentage points. And again, also if you include household fixed effects, these effects are significant at the 1% level. The effects are also not driven by any particular country or region. Like for estimated kind of urban exposure effects for every country separately, I find that the urban exposure estimates are significant in 13 out of 14 countries primary school completion, 7 out of 13 countries for school attendance, and 6 out of 12 countries for literacy. And among the insignificant countries, the majority or almost all of the estimates are actually positive, which kind of implies a more precision issue than certain countries don't benefit. The exception actually is South Africa, where I continuously find negative but insignificant estimates. And this is interestingly enough, actually also consistent with the cross-sectional evidence, with South Africa being cross-sectionally the only country where children in urban environments have lower rates of school attendance compared to children in rural environments.
Raoul?
Also, yes.
We have just a question on the previous graph you were showing. From Jorge Aguero about the y-axis. Is it varying?
Yeah,
from graph to graph?
It's varying slightly. I think the tables in the paper are a bit more informative if you want to compare the exact differences, and they're typically not significant different from each other. The problem you get is that, or yeah, it's about the axis. Yeah, it's about the scaling. No, that's actually a good point. I should make consistent scaling. It's like they move a little bit because when you include household fixed effects, kind of you have to normalize one of the estimates to 0, which makes a level difference. But the scaling is a good point. I should make that consistent. Thank you for
okay, thanks. You have just 5 minutes left.
Perfect. I also don't find evidence that results are driven by shocks to initial household conditions. For instance, you may worry that there's a certain positive shocks to households, which induces them to migrate to an urban area, and it's not really the move itself I'm studying to other these initial events. If we focus on subsets of moves where there's like exceptionally large migration outflows from the region of origin, which means it's less likely to relate to household specific conditions to move, the results are basically the same. And I also do not find that any of the effects are driven, say, by civil violence or household income structure related to agriculture. And finally, I would have spent a bit more time on this, but Martin already asked about this earlier, so went over this. The results also do not seem to be driven by the selection within the region of origin of destination, using kind of these more detailed measures of do you live in an urban or rural area within your previous region of residence, and also the more detailed data I have on the current region of residence for a lot of countries. In terms of heterogeneity, I think what's very interesting is that I find that the childhood exposure or childhood urban residence in city has more beneficial effects for girls compared to boys, particularly in the case of school attendance, which is different what we find in Western countries, where in general neighborhoods matter more for boys. I also find that the increase in educational attainment is visible basically for areas independent of the education of the household heads. So it's not the case that if your household head is better educated, worse educated, you benefit more. So it doesn't complement or substitute household characteristics. This kind of stands in contrast to Chet and Hendren. You find in the US that wealthier households kind of have benefit more from moving to good neighborhoods. And I think what's very interesting is that what I find is that the effects decline over time. If I put some kind of structure on the urban exposure estimates, in this case, I put basically a linear line through these individual estimates. What I find is that spending your childhood in a city has larger effects on primary school completion, school attendance, and literacy in the censuses that were taken in the 80s and the 90s, compared to if you look at the very same countries, so only look at countries with multiple censuses, their census in the 2000s. So it seems to be the case that rural regions have been catching up somewhat over time, which is also consistent, of course, with kind of the Millennium Development Goals that were active at the time, where in particular they try to improve the educational attainment in rural regions. Finally, I will use my minutes for to talk a little bit what kind of explains this increase in schooling in the urban areas. And I think there are two types of potential explanations. One is migrating to an urban environment may change family formation decisions. And what I find is that children migrate to childhood to the urban environment have lower rates of childbirth at ages 16 and 17 and lower rates of being married. But the age at which you move to a city is not at all related to this reduction. So children who decide to migrate to a city at age 1 or age 13 basically have the same reduction in childbirth and married being compared to children who move to a rural area. So that cannot explain kind of the exposure. What instead seems to be the case is that there's a strong effect of the age at which you move to a city on the probability that you work, either way outside of the home or that you're helping out your family in home production, either way in the farm or working in the households itself. And what's interesting is that the decrease in labor force participation, I find, is basically the same to the increase in school attendance. So it really seems to be the case. If you migrate to an urban environment at a young age, you kind of substitute working for schooling. Now, then the next question is, what explains this trade-off? And there are, of course, many mechanisms to explain it, including changes in access to schools, opportunity cost of education, tourism education, the family income effects. It's very difficult to disentangle this. What does seem to be unlikely, that is a very simple story of, well, we migrate to the city and the parents start to earn more, because even if you look at children who end up in, well, I wouldn't directly call them slums, but definitely the worst neighborhoods, like they don't have access to electricity, don't have access to water, they don't live in durable housing. Even if we look among the educational outcomes of these children, we do see they benefit slightly less than children who end up in the better areas, but this difference is relatively small and they still benefit a lot from moving to a city at an early age, even though they don't end up in kind of the most beneficial parts of the city. And what's very nice is evidence from Guinea in 2013 to actually ask children, if you're no longer in school at age 13 to 18, why did you drop out? And the evidence you get from the census very strongly suggests that there's kind of access to schooling and the high opportunity cost of education in rural houses plays an important role. But unfortunately, I only have the data to estimate this kind of mechanism for one country, so it's not necessarily informative for the rest. I think that's something I'm very much still working on. Just to wrap up, so what I find in this paper is I find substantial effects of kind of exposure to urban environments, or living in urban environment during childhood on the education outcomes in Africa. Spending childhood in a region which 1% more urbanized increases primary school completion by 0.08, 0.010 percentage points, and school attendance literacy by about 0.04 percentage points. And these results are kind of visible both within the household, between households, and virtually all subgroups and countries. And I think that in terms of the main takeaway from this, it means on the individual level, despite quite a lot of publications highlighting this risk of developing world cities, kind of poverty traps and detrimental to development, I find at least on average, doesn't mean for everyone, but on average, migration from rural to urban environments improves the opportunities for children in the educational outcomes. And we know from a wide range of literature, educational improvements in education also linked to improvements in health, improvements in happiness, and a variety of kind of dimensions outside of the labor markets. On the national level, my findings suggest that urbanization in the developing world can contribute to growth, not necessarily or also through structural transformation, but as shown in this paper, also by increasing human capital accumulation. And I think what's very interesting, quick one to highlight is this here, I've done a follow-up study in Brazil, where I find very similar effects on educational outcomes. And I also show that in the end, this translates into significantly higher adulthood earnings. I think that's the presentation. Sorry for probably going 3 minutes over time, but thank you very much.
No, perfect. Thank you very much, Raoul. We are open to your questions, so please raise your hand and we give you the floor. So we can begin with Martin, that directly raised your hand very fast.
I don't have any question. I like it a lot. I think it's really well done, and it was like very interesting. I was just gonna say something that at the end in the conclusion like struck my mind. So here you have, so most of the literature on migration, on international migration, you know, migrants are positively selected. So you have the brain drain, right? So the best live, right? So you have this loss of human capital. So here with internal migration, people stay in the country and they actually get even higher human capital, right? So it seems like the best of both worlds. So to me, yeah, I think it's very interesting to connect it with what is happening with all this literature on the brain drain, right? And how fostering internal migration retains the people, right? And even fosters higher human capital, right? So I thought that was a way to say it.
That's a very good point. I actually never thought about making a connection, but yeah, good point. Thanks for the suggestion.
Please, Etienne, go ahead.
Yeah, so I have 2 questions actually. The first is about like the main assumption of a paper, which is that the age of the children when the household migrates is independent from the cost of migration, basically, right? And so that seems like quite a strong assumption to me, because like having a 2-year-old child doesn't have the same cost as having a 10-year-old child. And so that really might affect the probability that the household migrates to a urban area. And the second question is just, since your results show that moving from rural to urban areas increases the educational attainment, I was wondering if you had some numbers about like migration from urban to rural areas. I guess it's much more rare, but if you have this kind of data, maybe you can show that there is a decrease in the educational attainment, so that could just reinforce your conclusions.
Yeah, I think those are very good points. Yeah, I definitely agree that it is a strong assumption. And I think a lot of people have been in some sense surprised that it worked in the US. I think there was a lot of skepticism. And so I definitely agree on that. But I think what's kind of interesting, if you just look in the raw data, for instance, you don't see like a strong decline by the number of movers by the age. So if you look at, of course, this is conditional on these long distance moves. I think if you would look at very kind of short distance moves would be different. But if you just look in the raw data, the number of children moved at age 1 is more or less the same as those moved at age 5, it's more or less the same as moved at age 10. So I agree that there definitely conceptually could be reasons why certain households do or don't move, and how the costs of migration are linked to the age of the children. But I think with these really long distance moves, particularly if you think, for instance, moving to the capital, there are so many costs related to the uncertainty related to finding housing, finding the job, that I'm not sure that having to find a school for your children is necessarily the key driver in that. And in particular, also, if there would be some drop in the number of households that move, it's not necessarily a problem, as long as kind of the selection of the households which drop out into urban and rural environments doesn't change. But at least in this case in Africa, I don't see this drop. I see the number of movers across regions still being kind of the same by all ages. which kind of implies that at least for these specific type of moves, I think if you would look at short distance moves within the regions would be very different, at least the very long distance moves, the costs do not seem to kind of be the key driver there. Regarding your second question, I think it's really interesting indeed. Right now, I only have these rural to urban moves. Sorry, the urban to rural moves is kind of like a fun heterogeneity analysis. But there are, I think it's about a third of the households moves to like from a city to a more rural environment. And there's also quite a bit of movement, for instance, out of the capital city still. Individuals would choose to leave the capital city. For now, I only have some kind of robustness check, but I could give a little bit more prominence. I think that's a nice suggestion.